I'm here to share with you a piece of work that we did early on in the year alongside a company called Forward Thinking Inc. Forward Thinking Inc. is a strategy company, and we have worked with them for many years. And I'm here to share with you some insights of a project that we did. But I want to start with a caveat. This is not deep dive peer-reviewed research, okay? So this is not, it's not been through the academic mill. But at Herman Miller, we like to take a variety of approaches to trying to understand the experience of work of what we can do and therefore help you to make it a better experience. And what this is a subset of our view of well-being. And we know that as firms transition to what for them may be a new way of working, whether that's a hybrid way of working, there is hope that we will be able to change the world of work for the better. But we have to acknowledge we have been through an amazing time, and we have to try to understand the impact that the pandemic has had on individuals if we are to prepare for the future, the near future and the far future. And so what we did at Herman Miller is we worked with Forward Thinking to have a big conversation or a big discussion to incorporate some understandings from users. So let me tell you how we did this. We chose 5 leading companies, and if any of those companies are on, thank you very much for allowing us to participate. We ran a 2-week online forum from these 5 global organizations with people at different levels. And then we wanted to learn some of the lessons from individuals. Now, there is some incredible work out there, research done by amazing organizations, the JLLs, the CBREs, the Leesmans, that's done those 20, 30,000 people surveys, and they're really valid and useful. And we've got research that from over 20,000 people that did working from home. But we wanted to get a little personal snapshot into people's feelings and their lives. And so we created this big discussion where we discussed the thoughts and ideas that people had. We wanted to understand things like, how has remote working impacted the way that they're working? How has it impacted the way that people engage with each other? What about collaboration? How has it impacted that? So we asked quite a few questions, and out of it, we've got some key insights. Again, these are insights and thoughts from over 50 or 60 people that took part in this conversation. And I think you'll find them of interest, but what I also can tell you is they're backed up by lots of other non-Herman Miller research that continues to say this, but what we're bringing is down to a personal level. What I'm going to do is give you some key insights around some of the thoughts and themes that come through. And I'm going to break some presentation rules because I am going to read quotes from the conversation, from the slide, because I think these are really important. And I want you to think about what your experience was like and whether you've seen some of these challenges that we talk about and the opportunities in your experience. So one of our first key insights was this whole idea that productivity started to improve. And before I go on, I just literally yesterday saw a blog from a speaker that we've got with Herman Miller in 2 weeks' time, Neil Usher. He said this, that yet during multiple lockdowns, the productivity boom was discernible both subjectively and objectively. Perhaps for many, for the first time, we felt productive. We were getting through stuff. We upcycled our commute into untrammeled achievement. We committed where once we would have merely presented. And this is what we found out through this conversation. What we saw is that people started to value that commute time. It was a key driver. It made them feel like they were contributing more, they were making and being more productive. Now, I have some other things and other views around the commute, which is quite interesting, so I will come back to that later. What we also found, what contributed to productivity, was this ability for many, and again, not all, that there was an opportunity for people to do that great focus work. But this wasn't the case for everyone. But some people found some of that deep concentration work suddenly, they were in a situation where they could control it. And another part of the discussion showed us this, that what was enabled for these workers at home is at last they could choose, if they had the setup, the space, and maybe the support from the company, they could choose the way that they wanted to work at home. They could choose the kind of setting which they had not had the opportunity to do when they were in the workplace. So there was this individual work setting for some, but of course we know that for some that was not the experience because they were unable to. And again, our research showed that many people were unable to do it because they didn't have either the physical setting or even the social setting to curate a space. But for some, their productivity levels went up. But what we found, though, in this discussion, and again, when you look at the work from many others, effective, deep collaboration in some areas were impacted. Now, that doesn't mean that collaboration fell flat on its face, and in some areas it improved. And again, we're going to look at that in a moment. So overall, productivity has started to improve. And this whole idea that suddenly, can we measure productivity? The world didn't collapse and companies didn't collapse. So here are some quotes that I wanted to read you. These are quotes from the conversation. I have saved 2 hours commuting time every day, which has made a big difference to productivity and work-life balance. No distractions. I am way more focused at home. I really like the collaboration, flexible working spaces in the office I work in, so would go back to those. So it's a mixture of conversations. And by the way, the reason I'm reading these comments out is that some people are joined by audio only and wouldn't be able to see them. So I didn't want to just leave them to be read. And another insights that we had was this whole idea of connectivity, that connectivity was effective both positively and negatively. Now, what we found was that the intra-team, within your own team, what people found is the connections actually improved. There was even more connection than they had before. A lot of that was because it was scheduled, it was a part of the plan. They were not deciding not to rely on those kind of chance encounters that used to happen in the office. Lots more planning around team connections. And I know my colleagues would agree that's certainly the case in our business. Much more driven connections within the team. But during this conversation, there was something that came out which we have seen and has also been spoken about over many years, is the weakened inter-team. What a guy called Mark Granovetter called weak ties. In this thesis, Mark said this, that it's in this thesis, weak ties, acquaintanceships that are not reinforced by many mutual friendships, are especially pivotal in the flow of information. And what we found is there was this lack of those chance encounters. However shallow they might be, those interactions. If you've ever heard us talk about the psychology of collaboration, that to get to deepen connection, you need those loose interactions. And they started to suffer from team to team. And that was an impact of connectivity. But what we found a really positive result, and again, we've acknowledged this, we started to see improved international connections. Now, we do know that the technology has improved even over the last year. The WebEx, the tool that we're using now, has improved hugely. But the tool was there before for us to connect internationally. But suddenly, what we saw is this more inclusiveness, this ability to connect globally and have people join globally. And that has been a positive impact. But of course, something that I talked about earlier, this whole idea that the connections, there are less spontaneous connections, and that many connections were kind of synthetic, almost, okay, let's just play, let's get together, let's have a little get together, rather than those chance encounters. Now, I know there's lots of different views about whether chance encounters matter, but sometimes that one little spark of conversation can make a difference personally, or even for the business as well. And then the other challenge of the connectivity is that for many, there was this feeling of isolation. Not everyone has the ability to connect at home, but also I'm working in I'm lucky enough to have my home office, but I'm kind of in here 70–80% of my working day, and I connect virtually, but there is this kind of odd feeling of isolation. One of the positive things that came out of this conversation, this kind of big discussion, was this, that some were starting to see that written communications, they started to improve, because it's no longer sending an email to someone across the desk and they can just check it out by getting up and coming round to you. There has to be more careful consideration of communication. So we started to see those written communications being really important. And of course, we saw a lot of written communications being increased because of both synchronous and asynchronous communication, whether that's email, live chat, all those kind of things as well. So some of the quotes. I actually do feel that working remotely has improved collaboration in our team. We've got more frequent meetings. Another comment, less interaction, especially with other teams who we do not work with on a daily basis. I now catch up with my German counterpart far more often because it is no different to scheduling a meeting with anyone else. It can be quite lonely. You do get a sense of almost bunker isolation. The next area that we started to see was almost a discussion around culture and identity. And we had a mixture of levels in this big discussion, but what we found from the managers, there was this real desire to keep a team culture, a team identity, that people didn't get lost in the mass of suddenly being a whole company working from home. Because suddenly what had gone are those neighborhoods, those co-located teams or whatever. And so was there a threat to the identity? And some said this, that corporate culture is harder to reinforce without the visual and behavioral cues of the office. We know that physical space does have an impact. It communicates messages, it tells us to do things, a bit like urban planning that kind of tells us what we can and can't do without having to have signs. Some of those visual cues are missing in the virtual world. And remember this, I think it was Leisman that said that over 50, almost 60% of people that suddenly were working from home last year had never ever done this before. So for them, this was a completely new experience of trying to learn what being part of the culture was, and that the identity in the culture was potentially under stress. But a particular challenge came about for new joiners who they were anxious to feel that they were part of the business. And we've seen this common. Now, it's not impossible to onboard, but literally today, I can see going on in our London showroom is a team of our global account managers, and a lot of them are meeting each other for the first time ever. So that's kind of weird. So that onboarding process is not impossible, but it is not easy. And this whole idea of how do you onboard new joiners, because of course, there are lots of great playbooks and written rules, but what you start to learn when you meet with each other in those kind of physical spaces are some of the unwritten understandings which really matter, that often make up the culture of a business. So a quote, the workplace gives a corporate identity, the tangible things like architecture, workspace, lighting, ergonomic meeting rooms design, and a variety of facilities. And another quote, junior members of the team, such as myself, are missing out not only on the chance to learn, by osmosis. Now, the other thing that we started to recognize is the kind of expression of individuality, and that this whole idea that perspectives and priorities were varying incredibly widely based on different circumstances. And those circumstances can be incredibly wide, whether that is the kind of the physical circumstances at home, whether it was the social circumstances at home, whether it was the hierarchical circumstances, whether it's on the personality spectrum. All of those circumstances were really, really different. And this is no different to what happened in the office. There was no one size fits all for productivity, and that we all react differently. And again, the same kind of situation in the office. If you come out of a bad meeting, you're kind of not going to be as productive as if you come out of a good meeting. And so suddenly what you started to see is a recognition that we can't treat everyone, okay, they're accountants, so they're like this. That's the IT department, so they're like this. And that we had to start looking not at individual teams, but as individuals, starting to do human-centered work. So this whole idea that no one size fitted all in this world of individuality. And of course, this is an opportunity and a challenge for the individual and the organization. What do I mean by that? Well, now you can start understanding your people. Whenever I say, I get asked by clients, what's the first thing that we need to do when we talk about returning to the physical workplace? And I first say is understand your people. You cannot start anywhere else than understanding your people. But boy, that's hard. That is not easy. That's where you have to treat people as individuals and not generations, not departments, not trades or professions. We have to treat people as individuals. I have found work from home bringing in a gradual feeling of isolation from colleagues and friends, and from the general sense of feeling and camaraderie. What is important, I think, is flexibility. Working environment should be flexible so that each individual can work in the most efficient way. And the next area of insight is to this whole idea of responsibility. Now, many people, remember what I said, more than 50% had never done this at home. Many people, they just had to walk in and go and sit at a desk. And that, for some people, is exactly what they wanted to do. It suits them. We always talk about giving everyone choice, but someone might choose to do the same thing all the time. But suddenly, for some people, they were facing this autonomy and freedom and having to make decisions for the first time. But we know this, that autonomy really does make a difference. Giving people the freedom to choose, it's a fundamental human need. And autonomy is on a spectrum. For some people, it's low level. For others, they want most of it. But you would have heard me say this before if you've attended my webinars. Autonomy is freedom within boundaries. Anarchy is freedom with no boundaries. So it is kind of giving people freedom, but within a structure. And we all know, and the reality is this, that what has been stolen out of the last year, this sounds quite odd, for me is autonomy. It's the freedom to choose. That's what went, because suddenly I was being told to work from home. And I want to give you a warning, if I may, not necessarily related to this piece of research, but we are talking a lot about hybrid working, maybe working from home 2 days a week or 3 days a week. Don't let that autonomy be threatened in that situation. It should not be about telling people you're going to work at home for 2 days a week and in the office 3 days a week. That suddenly is going back to those old ways of command and control. So be very careful how you introduce your hybrid working. As I mentioned, suddenly people were given added responsibilities. It required people and their managers to know themselves, to almost understand what was good for them, what's the good environment. They've got to almost work out, and they've got to think about their working day more than they may have done in the past. And that was really, really important. And in knowing themselves, they could then co-curate what was their optimal work experience or their environment, or could they? That was the challenge. We started to do that and assume, okay, everyone's working from home, but I think I saw the quote that is, everyone's in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. And that is a real challenge. But some people could co-curate. So here am I with a lovely Herman Miller chair, a nice Herman Miller desk. You know, it's wonderful. Lots of people don't get that opportunity, and our research outside of this has shown that to be the case. We all work best in a different way and environments. I think it's important that we understand that what makes us effective, and with the right support, fashion a work style that's best for us. I actually feel like my concentration has been impacted negatively by working from home, in that you do not have the same constraints of being in a work environment and having the pressure of being on all the time. And actually, I think I need that. And then we start to look at this whole idea of variety. And I found this a fascinating part of the big discussion. That actually a traditional workday for many, not everyone, so let's not generalize, but for many, the workday before the pandemic had this kind of built-in variety where people are commuting, the journey, the city. I mean, I spoke to someone on Sunday at church, actually, back to church, which is great. He normally does a 2-hour drive, and he said, I'm actually starting to miss it. Now, whether he'll miss it again if he starts it again, he said, because that's where I do my thinking, that kind of break time. And so there is that variety, you know, the kind of the nipping in, the kind of casual, the different meetings, the different spaces. It's a lot richer. It's a lot richer, fuller experience during when people, now, that again doesn't mean that it can't be richer and fuller at home, but there is a discipline needed to make sure that it actually happens. There are kind of things that I make sure that I go downstairs for a break at lunchtime, even if I can go to the local coffee shop sometimes during the day. Really, really important. And I love this. Home working is often from bed to lounge. Where is that kind of separation, and where is that variety? These day-to-day physical human interactions you have on the way to make a coffee, remember what Mark Granovetter said, those weak ties, or walking into the building in the morning, they're all gone. And some, not all, are replaced with what feels like quite synthetic replacements. There's an invisible wall that appears when we are totally virtual. Connectivity and social interaction feels forced when it's not in person. And then we started to see the subject of mental health, not just physical well-being, but mental health. And suddenly mental health came on the agenda. It suddenly found its way into the boardroom. For many boardrooms, it's never been in there. And we can see that from many reports of the way that some companies have treated their staff. But suddenly mental health started to move up the agenda, as we found out from these conversations. We found out that some companies have started talking about it and they hadn't done it before. One of the challenges is that employees have got a greater awareness of their own well-being, whether that's physical or mental, because of the pandemic. They're much more sensitized. Suddenly they're thinking about what matters. Suddenly they're thinking about what really matters, and their expectations have increased. And that it became very apparent during this big conversation, this big discussion. And for organizations, there's this whole implication for purpose of the individuals and of the business. And I was on a call this week with someone, and we talked about some companies where some individuals are trying to think about what is it they do and is it really making a difference. You're going to have people questioning whether what they do is an essential profession anymore because of the nature of the pandemic. What is their purpose? And we all know that a sense of purpose makes a difference actually physically to our health. Some great research around that. It affects our mortality rate, having a sense of purpose. But mental health, how well a company treated their staff over the last year is going to impact their attraction and retention of talent. It really is going to matter. And then there is compliance. And I think my colleague Bertie, I don't know if he's on, said that he heard a talk from the health and safety executive in the UK who talked about we often get taken up by the compliance of ergonomics, and thank you, because that's really important for us, but we often ignore that there is a compliance around making sure that we take care of people's mental health. And that can be a broad spectrum. And a lot about that is not just about place, it is about the way that we manage people. I'm very conscious that I do not want to get back into the rat race of day-to-day inflexibility and poor work-life balance. I feel that my company has really changed people's perceptions of how much compassion they have. Wellbeing space also seems to be a feature of the expectation around our future offices, although I like this, although exactly what this will look like is still to be determined. And the last set of insights here is around the environment. And this is interesting because this started, I don't necessarily agree with all this, is what I'm going to say, because less commuting is seen as a big plus. It generally has potentially the potential for having a less of an impact on the environment. Of course, what I always raise and we've raised and seen articles about is, don't forget, we are now working in homes that would normally not have been heated or lit, or, you know, and we are not traveling. And there is a debate about the balance, but certainly less commuting has been seen as a big plus. And then what you start to see, though, is we do start to see companies questioning how they are using the footprint of their offices. And are they using effectively? And if you've got an office, it better be used to its absolute maximum to make sure that you are having the least environmental impact. No good having a big office and it's empty, even if it looks beautiful. And we see that employees are starting to question, and we know there's a huge debate now around, you know, it's not a, well, there shouldn't be a debate around climate change. What there is a debate is what we're going to do about it. And maybe it's our chance to do something about it and start monitoring and measuring. I love the fact that I save 2 hours a day, helps my pocket and the environment. I feel I'm making a contribution to the environment by not commuting. It is not just the time saved, not having to commute, but the reduction in gas emissions, more environmentally healthy, and promotes a balanced life. So that's some key insights. And out of that, my colleagues at Forward Thinking started to make some observations and come up with new thinking. And for some of you, it won't be new, but for others, it might just be ideas. So these are observation and ideas. The first observation is this idea of what we're calling individuation. What do we mean by that? Suddenly, you segment your staff not into groups, not into teams, not into departments, but suddenly individuals. And you give people the opportunity to be self-determinate. And this whole idea that they understand. So there are lots of ideas, and one of the ideas the team had is, do you have a working model assessment tool, whether that's anything like a Myers-Briggs type model? I'm not saying use Myers-Briggs, but somewhere where you assess what are people's individual needs? What is it that motivates them? And it's got to be beyond the physical needs. Are you doing some kind of assessment of what it is people need? And by the way, not just what they want. Really important. And now we start to see that the primary role, or I want to emphasize not the only role of the new office, is going to support inter-team and intra-team collaboration. But this is in addition to supporting individual focus workstations. And why do I say that? There are lots of people that are looking forward to going back into the workplace to concentrate because they haven't been able to focus at home. So you start to think about, what do those social spaces look like? What are they? And there is probably not one type of social space that's going to work either. There's going to be a mixture of them that you're going to support. Remember that team to team collision points, we've called them here. This whole idea that how do you get that casual? Now, this is not forcing people to talk to each other, but this is supporting connections as and when they might needed, but at the same time, still supporting individual focus. Just a comment about individual focus, that doesn't necessarily mean loads of booths and private offices. What it might mean is an area where the protocol is like a library, and you're in that area, and if you're in that area, your phone is off, and you're not having loud conversations or video conferences, but there is just that whole idea that people in the area have chosen that to focus as well. We can see that there's the whole idea of this increased awareness of well-being. The trouble is there's a lack of data, and I've started to see companies, there's a company called Arc Health, I know, and you may be on the call, where companies are starting to measure well-being. Why? Because at some point you're going to have to look at, are you complying? Are you supporting? Are you being truly inclusive? You might talk about having inclusive policy. What does that look like in reality? But as a part, you need to understand people's psychological capital. And I started to read into psychological capital. And this is something where you can measure, and there are tools out there. It's called the PsyCat tools, where you start to measure and you look at how people, what's their level of hope? How efficient do they feel? How resilient do they feel? How optimistic do they feel? And that whole idea that well-being is no longer a name that's somewhere on your annual report, but it is really within the discussions, and you're starting to manage it and measure it. And then starting to think about the culture and identity. And we see that hybrid models have the potential of affecting corporate culture. So you've got to look at how are you going to make that work harder. So you've got to think about, what is the culture? What are you trying to support? What are you trying to stop even? How do you then design your space and your business processes to support that culture? And I ask you this question: is the culture that you're now working under the right culture, but the individuals and for the business? And this starts to have strategic implications. It has implications for the organization, because now suddenly what you can start to do is maximize the potential for human capital, and apologies to those of you that hate that term, social capital, psychological capital. These are all the intangibles, the kind of intangibles that often aren't on the bottom line or on your annual report. Suddenly for organizations, you've got time, because you've got time. If you don't think about it now, you probably never will following the circumstances. And now you have the opportunity to create leaner, more efficient and more responsive organizations. You've got to look at the whole area of agility and flexibility. And I mean right across the business, from the flexible and agile business processes to flexible and agile spaces to flexible and agile transactions within real estate. It's now's the time to look at that as an opportunity, because it helps you manage risk more effectively as well. So what does that mean for employees? Well, there's some great opportunities for employees, because suddenly, if they get it right and are supported in the right way, they can achieve this better work-life balance or better work-life experience. Not for all, and for some people, they need to revisit the impact that work is having on their life outside of work, but take the opportunity to review what they're doing. And suddenly, employees can start looking at receiving and getting greater autonomy. And I do think we have to treat autonomy with respect and understand that it's a fundamental need that all of us want. Look at it from whether you're young or whether you're old, autonomy really does matter. It doesn't have a generational difference. But for the employees, suddenly they've got to think about themselves. They've got to start to take responsibility and knowing what is good for them, trying to understand what works for them. What's the best environment? What's the best work style? It's there. And consciously make this impact on the planet that we talked about, suddenly rethinking about all that traveling that you might no longer need to do. And then there are strategic impacts for working together. And this whole idea that suddenly you've got to develop this strategy that looks and puts interaction and collaboration at the core. That doesn't mean it's going to happen in the office, but it's got to happen in some way, because you know your future as a business is about being collaborative and creative and being connected as well. And suddenly you start to make it a source of differentiation and a competitive advantage. And we think that actually the whole pandemic is now giving us the opportunity to think of workplaces not as a cost anymore, but as a competitive advantage. And it's time, and we are seeing it happen, that you start to see this joining up of leadership, that HR, real estate, that suddenly we all own well-being. We all own the workplace. It's a part of this whole experience. I have never, and in fact, I was listening to a podcast, if you want to look at a podcast from Herman Miller called Looking Forward, listening to that this morning. And this whole idea that basically more and more companies are thinking about, where does real estate sit? Where does workplace strategy sit? Is it a HR function? Is it an IT function? Is it a real estate function? Because suddenly people are connecting, and we're seeing particularly HR having a bigger say in the work together. And finally, what you start to think about is the measurement. Understanding those intangible assets. Are there ways where you can measure productivity? Lots of debate about that, but there are some good tools out there, which I would say give you clues to whether you're doing a good job or a bad one. Can you measure social capital? Tools to measure identity. What about brand capital? Brand capital is an interesting one for me. How you treat your staff is having an impact on your brand capital, because your staff will tell their friends if you're treating them badly. That's really important. And then this whole idea of human capital. And I just wanted to finish with this. It is about data, not chatter. So I realize we've had this conversation where we involved these more than 50 people, but it has to be more than that. We now have to start going and looking and measuring that. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed that. Oliver, you can switch your camera back on now, and it will be.
Thank you very much for that, Mark. I know that's the first time that you presented that content, and it was very well delivered, so well done. We've had some really great engagement, some good comments and questions that have been posted in the chat box, a couple in the Q&A section as well, so I'll endeavor to try and cover them all. I also just posted a link in the chat box to the podcast that you mentioned, which features Ryan Anderson, basically interviewing a number of industry professionals. It's very, very good. So don't click it just yet, you'll have time. But let's address some of these questions for Mark and hopefully get some of his answers. Now, the first question that came in, just hold on one second. So I've just got to scroll up. Okay, so the first question that came in was from a gentleman called Oliver Baxter. Yeah, Oliver Baxter. And he says, is culture so fragile that it can't exist in the digital world? I wonder how companies who are remote first, like GitLab, who I think I've heard Ryan Anderson, our boss, Mark, mention that they're probably the most referenced company in the world in terms of a remote first strategy. So that's GitLab. How did they enable the culture they want in a digital world?
So for me, it is about intentionality. You've got to be intentional to make sure that your culture. Now, it's always easier when you start a company and that is the way you've started in a remote manner, which is what GitLab did a lot. A lot of companies that start remotely, that is their culture. The challenge is when you move from what was an in-person connection and an in-person meetings to then becoming more remote, that is where the challenge is. I am not saying that you can't have a great culture working virtually, but it's often, you look at the success of some of those almost all remote companies, they started off as being mainly remote companies, and that's the challenge. It's not impossible, but you have to be intention to make sure you maintain it and keep a check on it as well.
Good answer, Mark. Thank you for that. Next question is from Elizabeth. We've seen in some of our research that productivity improved in the beginning, but has since flatlined or decreased over time. Have you seen this as well, or have employees kept up their productivity and work-life balance?
Yeah, so I think, so we did this in April, and I think it started to be there about then when we started to see acceptance and productivity wane. It's the kind of the not again kind of thing. You know, it's, you know, we're in a situation in the UK, we don't know if we're going to get mini lockdowns or whatever, and you kind of get to that point was it's, and you've got the backdrop of potentially dying. I know that's a scary thing, so you've got all of that. So we think we're coming up, there's lots of ups and downs, but I think there are phases. And I think you're right, we all got excited about it at first. Originally, it kind of worked, and then there are people that have now just had enough. And it's not enough of working from home. It's just they've had enough of not being able to choose whether to work from home. And I think that is the important point that needs to be highlighted.
Yeah, I suppose this kind of also relates to the next question as well. You can probably reference a company that I'm thinking of right now. And this comes from, sorry, I forgot the name. ASA. These are great insights. Thank you. Are there any quantitative measures as well, for example, measuring productivity, connectivity, as these terms are very subjective?
Yeah, and there are tools. I've mentioned Leesman. There are good tools there, but there are social capital tools where you can measure, and you look at organisations like, I think it's Humanize, with Ben Waber, where they start to measure social networks as well, whether that's digital or physical, where you can kind of see who is connected. You've seen those spidergrams. So there are tools out there, and I don't have immediate reference, but if anyone else knows any of those, feel free to put them in the chat box. But you can measure it, but I always say this, measure it with caution. Don't treat it as the only answer. It's a bit like, you know, sensors. Measuring uses of a workplace only tells you one part. It doesn't tell you why they're using that workplace. So use measuring and monitoring carefully alongside other tools as well.
Okay. Giles, and still staying on that kind of productivity thread, kind of why is it that given that productivity has generally improved, or at least has stayed the constant, we still have some senior leaders that are trying to get their employees back into the office most of the time? Office attendance is important, but it feels like some leaders want to snap back to more or less the old ways and just pay lip service to this remote working.
And I think that there is a threat of that, the kind of command and control mentality, the Douglas Ware McGregor theory X and theory Y, where you enable people or you force people. I still think there is that mentality, and that people feel it's a sense of control for some people. They need people in their space, and it might be to justify those very high expenses. For me, I don't think the biggest threat is from very senior people. I think it's from middle management. That, for me, is, as I heard, we've got a speaker coming up later on in the year, and he calls these people the crusty middle. In other words, those people that are in the middle that feel threatened about not having people back in the office. I think they're the bigger threat, not necessarily the few companies that you hear that are making the headlines. And there are only a few. But I think the threat comes when a company says, yeah, we're going to go remote, we're going to do all this hybrid working. And somewhere there's this middle, the crusty middle management level that say, hang on, that's not what I joined up for.
Thank you, Mark. Okay. Long comment, short question at the end, but I think I need to go through both for it to make sense. This is from Brent. Recent article in the Times indicated that managers are facing many concurrent issues. The use of funded office space, unvaccinated and non-vaccinated, masked co-workers, disruption for children and school and caregiving. Mark, you highlighted a pivotal moment in time, and it appears that the employee-employer relationship has changed, including the growth of management activities. Here's the question. Will the greatest growth happen due to virtual first new organizations?
I don't know if I can answer that question, but I think for some organizations, it will be the catalyst for them becoming a better company. You know, there are some organizations that have been bogged down by whether that's property costs or whatever, and for some, and for others, it will be the breakup. Is my view. I don't have any empirical content around that, but I do think it is a pivotal moment. But let me express a little fear. Nothing might change as much as we think it is. That's my fear. We all think. My fear is that somehow we just go back in a year's time or 2 years' time to how it was, and that actually that what people start to do is they've got new offices, but they still work in the old ways. You know, it's you know, you sometimes you might give someone the ability to correct their posture, but they still sit in the old way. And I think some of the workplace is going to be like that. We're going to try and correct the way that people work, but the management styles aren't going to change to suit it. It is a big challenge. But again, I say this, if we don't take the opportunity now, we never will. We will never have a better time to create better workplaces than now, or work experiences, should I say.
Okay, so this one's from Shelley. I would welcome your thoughts on the role of lighting in supporting health and well-being in the workplace, be that home or in the office.
Yeah, you need to listen to the latest podcast from that I've mentioned already. This whole idea that light is so important. You may have seen though that I've just pulled a blind because it's got too bright outside the camera. But I think, and I'm sure you're probably in the world of lighting because that often is what prompts that. But you know, we do know that color, light, noise, all of those things affect our well-being. And again, though, it is giving people access to it if they want it. You know, it's kind of, it isn't about flooding a place with daylight when someone might prefer darkness. We have to accept that for some people, they prefer darker environments as well. So again, it's not autonomy. You're not being autonomous if you're flooding everything with light and someone wants like a calm, darker light. But there's some, you know, there are some different daylights, bulbs out there. There's lots of interaction. It's not a world I'm specialized in, but it's one part of the whole. Again, don't give everyone great lighting if you haven't given them a good chair.
Cool. Chand Kiran says, in regards to the last slide that you presented, Mark, you suggested measuring the intangibles, such as brand capital and productivity, the forever debate. How do you suggest measuring these?
Yeah, so you can look at tools like, again, I'm sorry I mention it again, Leesman. The company that did the research for Forward Thinking also measure some of those as well. There are lots of change management and companies out there that measure it, have tools, and sometimes it might be useful to measure with two different companies, which sounds odd, but you want to get a correlation and a kind of work out on almost a check. But it is not the answer to everything, okay? It starts to give you, and Oliver, you can probably answer it better than I about measuring productivity and the psychological aspects of it as well. So, because it is...
It's like, how many words can you type in a minute? You know, how fast can you read a book? These are the efficiencies of productivity, but productivity doesn't encapsulate everything that work is. And I think we have to remember that it's not creativity, it's not innovation, and actually productivity is a subset of engagement, which is a much easier and kind of encompassing thing to measure. So if you look at like the work that Gallup has been doing, measuring engagement all over the world, you know, people who are more engaged, so more highly motivated people, greater productivity, greater share price for those organizations, greater profitability for those businesses as well. So I think we're far too fixated on something that was really relevant like 40, 50 years ago when we were just doing task of rote. And now work is so complex, we've transcended the basic ability of doing productive work. And now it's about ideation, creation, coming together and collaborating. So I think we need to stop talking about productivity, to be perfectly honest, and focus on engagement and other elements that have been easier to define and measure.
Yeah. The challenge is that company leaders still ask for it. So there are ways of doing it because the answer is often a number. I'm looking at time, Oliver, and I just want to remind people that when you leave this call, when you close, you'll be taken to a website. It is not my bank account. It is actually a SurveyMonkey request for you to do a survey of what you thought of this talk. So that's where it's taking you to. So if you just could do that for me, that would be really helpful. Oliver, if you wanted to close off.
Yes, so I've seen a few requests for people that have unfortunately had to drop out early, or some of their colleagues who weren't able to attend, if we could send the recording. Unfortunately, we don't share the recordings after the sessions, or the presentation, but what we will share is the white paper from this research. And we can, of course, arrange another session. And if everyone is willing, you know, I'm sure Mark would like to do another session on this again in the future as well. So look out for that in the events calendar, of which I have just posted in the chat box. So if you see that kind of last URL link there, hminsightgroup.com/HM events, you'll be able to see the upcoming calendar of speakers that are coming down the line from the Herman Miller Global Insight Group. So please stay tuned for those. We'd love to welcome you for future sessions. Thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you, Mark, for a fantastic presentation, sir. Really appreciated that. Everybody, enjoy the rest of your day.